Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. We have the great Jim Valliant with us today. We are going to talk about how the ethics of Christianity inundates our culture, how it affects us, even though we may be unaware of it. It seeps into our unconscious. Jim, he wrote the book, Creating Christ, so he knows a little something about this. Jim, welcome back.
It is always great to be here, Michael. Thank you so much. I've made Christianity a little bit of my study, and religion in general, and does dramatically impact even people who claim to be atheists or even people who claim to be
Sure.
ex-Christians are still affected by it in ways they don't even sometimes notice.
A way it has impacted me and on a broader scale isn't on particular not that it doesn't, but the big influence isn't on particular ethical precepts. But Aaron Smith actually talked about this on a recent episode he was on with Mark Pellegrino, but it affected me as well. And it's thinking of ethics in terms of duty sort of imposed from above. So when I say, okay, it's ethical to act in my own interests, or it's ethical to tell the truth, to be productive, I think on a subliminal level almost that these are like commands that I must do this. Not that the purpose of ethics is to benefit me in my own life and to live an enriched existence, but it's to have this sort of I better be moral by this idea. Nathaniel Branden actually wrote about this in the either the epilogue or the footnotes in Psychology of Self-Esteem, where he said some people take it as if it's a sin against a thing called morality, and not just a sin against yourself. Now, I don't like the word sin, but you know what I mean, and doing harm to oneself. But to say that Christianity has sort of inundated us, what are some of the Christian morals? For instance, honesty is not something that Jesus taught. I mean, I know it's in the Ten Commandments about not to bear false witness, but in the New Testament, what are some of the ethical principles that Jesus and the apostles teach?
Well, Christianity's ethics has changed. That is to say, the operative ethics that Christian theologians teach in substance has changed considerably over the last 2,000 years. So, if the standard here is the ethical teachings of Christian people who call themselves Christians in the last 200 or 300 years, I would distinguish that very, very sharply from the ethical teachings in the New Testament, which were largely and faithfully followed for the first 15, 1600 years of Christian history. If we mean that, if we mean the doctrines that you can find in the New Testament, in the sacred writings, the original writings of Christians, then we have, I can give you very clear answers. Jesus is, in fact, that's mostly what Jesus is articulating. In Matthew, there's the famous Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, there's the famous Sermon on the Plain. But in John, he's got a whole new batch of teachings that he gives in private conversations and elsewhere. So we have the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, and we also have the moral teachings of St. Paul in his letters, which are considered to be the oldest parts of the New Testament. Now, so if we go by the ethical teachings of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament, they're very clear. And they are going to strike someone who's familiar with ancient history is very familiar. They're predicated on Platonic dualism, the Stoic logos, Cynic asceticism. It's enshrining some of the worst elements in ancient Greek philosophy are being enshrined in there. So what you have is Jesus uh, being opposed to money, being opposed to sex, being opposed to working to make your life better here on earth. You know, look at the lilies of the field, look at the birds of the air. Look, God, the lilies don't need any fine clothes but we worry so much about what we wear. Look at the birds of the air. They don't toil, they don't work, and yet God feeds them. So do not worry about stuff like that, where your next meal is coming from, where you're looking good, material things. In fact, Jesus goes so far as to say material possessions are, in fact, a big, big mistake and a trap. The rich young man comes up to him. I've obeyed the commandments of Moses. What do I need to get into the kingdom? He says, give away all your money to the poor. The rich young man walks away, sort of thinking about it. Jesus turns to his disciples and see how difficult it is. It's as difficult for a rich man to enter heaven as it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Paul, in his writings, says, the love of money is the root of all manner of evils. It's normally kind of mistranslated. The love of money is the root of all evil. It's not quite what he says, but it's something very closely related. It's all sorts of evil comes from the love of money. And so, because the poor are the ones who are fortunate. Blessed are the poor. Being poor is a mitzvah, is a good thing, is a woohoo. You're poor. Lucky you.
Jim, you
Let's
say
go through.
mitzvah. You got to. What is a mitzvah?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm using the Jewish word meaning a blessing, a good thing. That's a mitzvah. Hooray. Let's party. It's a mitzvah. So when Jesus says, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek, what he's saying is those are the lucky ones. He's reversing standard expectations. We think the rich are the lucky ones. No, 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 Jesus says. The poor are the lucky ones. They're the fortunate ones. And to spell this out even further, in the book of Acts, we're told the disciples hold all of their property in common. Just one example of it. I can go on and on and on like this. The material well-being here on earth is absolutely not the goal. The goal is to get into the kingdom of heaven, and our focus should be on the kingdom of heaven. In no less than 4 places, for example, in the New Testament, slavery is explicitly endorsed. And in one of those sections, you're particularly blessed, it's a particular mitzvah, to have a harsh, cruel slave master, because that's a salvation opportunity. Why is that a salvation opportunity? Well, Jesus explains. In the kingdom of heaven versus the here on earth, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. So if you're in a miserable, low, horrible condition here, you are better off than someone who is well off, the rich guy, the guy who seems to have it all in this life. He's the one who's got a problem in the next world, you see. So Jesus is opposed to, and St. Paul are opposed to sex. Paul explicitly says, I'm a celibate. I do not have sex. If you can receive this doctrine, do so. If you can't, then you have to get married. Marriage is sort of the fallback sex containment policy. It's better to marry than to burn. But on the other hand, if you can be totally celibate, like Paul says he is, that's the way to go. But if you really can't, if you really can't handle total celibacy, get married. Marriage is sort of the way we contain this dangerous lust thing. Jesus has a vaguely equivalent doctrine. Goes like this. He says some people are eunuchs, castrated, eunuchs made by men. Some people become eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. I say if you can do that, again, it's like one of these optional things. If you can receive that doctrine, receive that doctrine. In other words, be a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake if you can. It seems to be the implication. Now, there are early Christians who took that literally. One guy, Oregon, early Christian writer, we are told, castrated himself in front of the class to literally become a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake in obedience to Jesus's command there. He's a Christian, an early Christian. But at the very least, we can walk away with the idea that sex, money, enjoying life on earth, working here to make your life better, that is not the way to go. What you want to do is be humble, forgiving. The good parts of Jesus's morality, if I could put it that way, are places where I think even rational moralists would agree, is he complains about hypocrisy. Don't complain, don't go bitching and moaning about the splinter in someone else's eye when you got a big plank in your own, buddy. Now, I disagree with the application of it because he's forgiving about everything. Everything. For example, when he interrupts the stoning of the woman who'd sinned under Mosaic law, if you commit adultery or other sex crimes, the penalty is the death penalty. You're stoned to death for sex crimes. So if the woman committed adultery, there she's properly being stoned by her Jewish community. Jesus interrupts the stoning, we're told, and says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Now, in that regard, I disagree with him. But there he's chiming into a sort of Platonic idea of perfection and forgiveness. Perfection is impossible. Sinning is inevitable. Let me give you an example of how Jesus modifies the Mosaic law in this respect. Jesus says, "You've heard it said, thou shalt not kill." That's part of the big Ten Commandments, the law of Moses. I tell you that if you feel anger in your heart, you've already sinned. You've heard it said, thou shalt not commit adultery. That's also in the Big Ten and part of the Mosaic law. And he says, I tell you, if you feel lust in your heart, you've already sinned. So Jesus isn't waiting for you to kill anybody or to commit adultery before condemning you. He's saying that the thought, the emotion, even the lust or the anger already means you're a sinner. And of course, we can't help our emotions. Our
Well, I
emotions,
can tell. I was going to say, I can tell you're a luster.
I am.
You're a
And I get
luster.
angry too. I'll admit it. Sometimes I'll get really angry. Sometimes I'll be very lustful. Sometimes I'll be, yeah, a human being cannot walk through their ordinary life without feeling these emotions. So we are all condemned as sinners by our natures. We are by nature lustful, angry beings, right? And Jesus is saying, well, your nature makes you a sinner. You cannot help but be a sinner. And the emotion itself indicates. So if you have a sinful thought, see, Christian doctrine and developed as it developed over the ages said sin in deed, sin in heart, sin in. So, but just having an inner thought it can itself be a sin, right? And Jesus articulates that quite clearly. And perfection is, of course, impossible. No one deserves. Paul makes this very plain. For example, in his letter to the Ephesians, the only way you're going to get into heaven, baby, is by the sheer favor of God. If you believe in Jesus, it's an act of grace. No one can earn their way into heaven. You can't get there by good works, says Paul. You've got to do it by faith in Jesus Christ. And even in other places in the New Testament where that idea is modified a little, such as in the book of Matthew, Jesus says it's a combination of faith and being good because of that faith. Sort of it's a combined view. Still, faith is the sine qua non. The famous line from John 3:16, whosoever believes in him shall not perish. John 3:17. But if you don't, you're condemned. So the idea is belief in Jesus is the magic passkey to the kingdom of heaven. It has nothing to do with your virtue. And indeed, you can be forgiven. You can be a serial killer. You can be a torturer. You can be the worst kind of criminal imaginable. But if on your deathbed you find Jesus, you get in.
Yeah.
You can be a wonderful person, not obey the law of Moses your entire life, at least by the standard of the law of Moses, you can be obedient and still not get into heaven if you don't believe in Jesus. So, but I never killed anyone. I never committed adultery. Sorry. You still
Jim,
don't get into heaven.
as a young guy, I actually had this mapped out. This was my plan. I figured I could live and be as rotten as I wanted. And I said, but when I'm dying, I'm going to accept this Jesus. And so I get the best of both worlds. I get to be as rotten as I want to be and live in sin here on earth. And then I'll go into paradise. But it seems to me that
Jesus is asked about this, and Jesus says everything can be forgiven except blasphemies against the
oh,
Holy Spirit.
yes.
And even as he's being nailed up on the cross, he's saying, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. In other
Yes.
words, executing Messiah himself can be forgiven. It's just you can't blaspheme against the Holy Spirit. That's the only big unforgivable no-no. But what that does is it has the effect of making people think that forgiveness is somehow the important thing here. No, not forgiving until it's earned is the important thing here. And there's no earning of forgiveness under Christianity at all. So it has a totally different
No,
perspective.
it's grace. It's given by
Right. It's
grace.
grace. It's grace. So insofar as there are rules, they are the modified law of Moses, if you will. Jesus, Christianity is, I would describe its ethics as a modified version of the Mosaic law, where circumcision, kosher diet, strict Sabbath observance, animal sacrifices have all been done away with. On the other hand, Jesus has amplified the law of Moses in certain respects,
Right.
saying that even an emotion can be a sin. and no one is perfect, and getting into the kingdom of heaven is what's all important, which had not been the focus of the Torah.
So in Christianity, the basic virtues, it seems, are faith. We are to accept things without evidence, believe things without evidence. We're to forgive people who harm us, whether they deserve forgiveness or not. We're to engage in self-denial to the best of our ability, which is ultimately impossible. So we're always going to be sinners. This seems to me like a recipe for uncertainty and neuroticism.
Oh,
Yeah,
unearned guilt.
yeah,
There
uncertainty,
you are.
guilt,
Every time you feel
neuroticism.
anger and
Yes,
lust, every time your human nature asserts itself, you're feeling guilt,
right.
totally unearned guilt for your basic biological nature. But as Paul puts it, the great virtues are faith, hope, and love. Sometimes translated as charity, giving love, the love of a mother or paternal love, something like it. Faith, hope, and charity. And the greatest of these is love in that sense. And he defines love as altruistic. When you read his definition of love in First Corinthians, it's does not promote itself, it sacrifices itself, it gives itself up, it doesn't puff itself up, it doesn't think of its own interests. Love is altruism, says Paul, and faith, hope, and that kind of love are the essential virtues, Christian virtues, says Saint Paul.
So, how do these things seep into our unconsciousness or our subconsciousness, rather? How does this happen? What is the mechanism by which so many of us have these? Because it's even, if you watch a movie, for instance, right? It's so easy to see the guy who sacrifices everything for somebody else. Oh, what a hero. I remember watching this when I was in prison. They showed us this movie called Pay It Forward, and it was all about altruism. And now, by this point in my life, I was thoroughly, aware of the game. And so I criticized the whole, the kid ended up dead at the end. For spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, sorry. But the kid ends up dead at the end, his self-sacrificial ways. The people he helps are ultimately not very good people. So I didn't see it as good logically. But while I watched the movie, and this is a long time ago, I hope I'm remembering accurately. But while I'm watching the movie, I'm pulling for the kid. It seemed always so nice. It's just good stuff because that stuff has been drilled into us, right? So, how does that happen? Why is it? Does it permeate our culture to the extent that it does?
Well, there's two ways of deriving your ethical principles, aren't there? One is by a self-conscious, logical process of thought, where you take the evidence and you inductively infer generalizations, like we've discussed in our earlier discussions of ethics. You infer, for example, hey, wait a minute here. In order to earn your trust, I've got to be consistently honest. For just take one little example, for example. Now, that's not the final justification of honesty, obviously, or the full understanding of it, but you could either derive it from experience based on the needs of human life through a process of rational, logical integration of the evidence that you get from observation, like any other science, or, and this is what makes ethics different than any other science, you can absorb it by osmosis emotionally. And because we have, until Ayn Rand, objective ethics really, in my view, did not exist. The dominant view in academia today is that you can't have objective ethics. They're stuck with David Hume's, you can't derive an
Okay.
objective
I have
from
a
it.
question. I want you to clarify something. When you say there was no objective ethics, you're not saying that nobody ever behaved objectively
Oh, no,
ethical.
I'm saying
You're saying
killing.
there was no enumerated or no elucidated idea of objective
They
ethics.
had all kinds of good ethical ideas. And good ethical ideas, in fact, accumulated through the ages. Ethical knowledge, real ethical knowledge, is accumulated through the ages. For example, not murdering people, respecting their property rights. Those are very important ethical principles that were discovered a long time ago. More recently, people have discovered that slavery is inherently wrong and they should never be. So we've accumulated over the ages all kinds of valid uh, ethical precepts, I would say, and they did come insofar as they are rational from experience, inductively from experience, and confirmed by experience in their application. So on a micro level, we had good ethics, good ethical ideas here and there. Consider what you were saying earlier about the commandments. Now, some of them are they're just a set of rules. That's not the way we should approach ethics. Why are we being ethical? That's what we didn't have. We didn't have a grounding of ethics. So tell me what it is that this value thing is. Well, what is the standard of value? What am I doing when I'm being ethical? How should I approach it in a principled way, and why? That kind of objectivity to the subject of ethics itself. Either it's obedience to God's commands, or the skeptic of today, the atheist, says, well, we can't derive an ought from an is. There is no objective ethics, in effect. So it's either mystical dogmatism, or it's this total skeptical subjectivism about ethics. And Ayn Rand, of course, cuts through all that and gives us, for the first time, the correct foundation for ethics, an objective science of ethics, if you will, rather than a mixed grab bag. And in so doing, you see, she turns it from a set of negative, out of context rules because God said so. See, the concept of God itself is inconsistent with objective ethics. You're just obeying God because God says so. Well, if I say to you, well, what is there a relationship? Thou shalt not kill, and don't take the Lord's name in vain. No, 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 no. The only thing that unifies them is that God doesn't want you to do them. Okay, but otherwise they're independent things. Not for Ayn Rand. She integrates ethics into a unified system of thought. Now, that's the beginning of a science of ethics, telling us why we need to be ethics, what values are all about, what is goodness, what is badness, and why do we pursue goodness. That was what was missing. And in the absence of objective ethics, that's what happens. Ethical values get transmitted, but in an emotional way. Our parents get upset at us. Really, we get punished for it. There are associational things. People, everyone, all of our peers agree. Ooh, yeah, icky. Ooh, yeah, cool. And so we absorb through our culture, our parents, our teachers, our peers, the media. We can absorb emotionally. And so it's astonishing. One of the phenomena about this is astonishing to me, how atheists in the West are generally all in agreement with Jesus's ethics. Jesus, for example, Jesus on self-defense is particularly egregious. You're asking about the substance of Jesus's ethics. Well, Jesus says, submit to the evildoer, love your enemy, turn the other cheek. That is to say, if you get smacked in the face, you can't run away, you can't block the punch, you certainly can't fight back. You got to say, okay, please hit me over here now. Submit to the evildoer and turn the other cheek. Total shmoo pacifism. Now, Christianity has, in practice, stepwise. That's one of the key areas where Christianity over the last 2,000 years has sort of stepped away from a strict adherence to the doctrine laid out by Jesus. But it is an unworkable, unearthly doctrine. And still people have this attitude. So, for example, if you kill in self-defense, people will say, oh, you had to do something bad to do something good. No, by killing in self-defense, you did something perfectly good with no bad attached to it, because intrinsically it's wrong to always kill. You see, that's the other thing. The really bad part of religious ethics is it gets people to think about ethics in the wrong way. They either think of it in an intrinsic way or a subjective way, and they're reduced to the two sides of that same coin: dogmatic absolutism or total subjectivism. Well, you see, it doesn't matter whether he's a mass murderer, he can still get into heaven. On the other side, boy, you're absolutely a sinner and you're morally condemned forever for whatever the selfish act is, or the act of self. You defended yourself, you hit back. Well, that's intrinsically wrong. And philosophers have sort of enshrined this view. You know, up to, say, Immanuel Kant, all ethical philosophers had some ultimate value in mind. The hedonists, going back to Epicurus, says pleasure is the standard of value. Others said happiness, or in Aristotle's sense of eudaimonia, successful living, the state of successful living, happiness. So no, 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 no. Kant said, no, you got to get that out of your head. Ethics has nothing to do with consequences. Ethics has nothing to do with happiness, success, pleasure. Get that? The greatest good for he was lived before the utilitarians, but greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest happiness, or the greatest pleasure for the greatest. Forget all that, says Kant. Consequences have nothing to do with ethics. Good is good in itself. We do good, whatever the hell the consequences are, even if it means your death, the death of your loved ones. Consequences are absolutely irrelevant. As Dr. Leonard Peikoff has argued, and as I've argued, that's a Holocaust waiting to happen. Do your duty regardless of the blood spilled. Consequences have nothing to do with ethics. But you see, Christianity gets people to think of ethics in an intrinsic way. You see, violence is intrinsically wrong. It doesn't matter whether it's aggressive violence or reasonable self-defense. They make no distinction between force as such, or aggressive initiating of force, or the reasonable self-defense. Well, reasonable self-defense is totally moral. Everything that makes the aggressive use of violence wrong makes self-defense right. And so this intrinsicist view of ethics is what even atheists, as I say, believe that Jesus' ethics is some kind of noble ideal, even if we can't live up to it. But in fact, all they're doing is relying upon the psychologically transmitted emotional values that they, even as atheists, got from their parents and their culture and so forth. If they'd lived 300 years ago, they wouldn't have this built-in inhibition against slavery. That is a relatively recent phenomenon among the ethical norms of the West. If they lived thousands of years ago, they might readily accept cannibalism and human sacrifice. Human values are a discovery. They're learned inductively. And if you don't know that ethics is a science that goes by a standard, that there's a function and purpose for values in our life, if you don't understand the objective grounding of it, if you've thrown in the towel on all that, you can't get rid of the need for ethics. You still have values. You still need values. You still have emotions. You still have goals. And so all of our atheist friends try and deploy a 2,000-year-old ethics of Christianity, claiming to be atheists because they have no idea where the objective basis of ethics actually comes from. Yeah. And they, too, are still haunted by contradictions. But to them, altruism is a given. Our atheist friends,
Richard Dawkins, who in many ways I think is excellent. His book, The God Delusion, I thought was great. The Ancestor's Tale was great. Very bright guy. But he says culturally he's a Christian.
Right.
And a lot of the new atheists, Sam Harris, for instance, it's exactly on ethics where they go backwards.
Ding, 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 ding. Give that man a cigar. That is exactly it.
Jim, I don't smoke cigars.
Okay, well, you get the metaphor.
Give me an energy drink. Give me an energy drink.
Energy drink. Give that man what he likes.
Well, if we're going to do that, we might want to go beyond energy drinks, but that's a discussion for a different
day. No, you're absolutely right. The great lacuna among our atheist friends is ethics, but they can't get their ethics squared away because their epistemology has been corrupted by modern philosophy as well. So it's the modern philosophers. It's those 17th, 18th, 19th century philosophers, in particular Immanuel Kant, but it's all those guys, more innocently perhaps Descartes, less innocently perhaps Hume, truly evil Kant, and in my view Hegel. It is the great modern philosophers of the last 300 or 400 years who've completely screwed them up. As I say, David Hume's the guy who taught them you can't get it, an ought from an is. For David Hume, living in a Christian world, you can understand why. There's no way you can validly derive Christian ethics from experience. But then again, there's no way you can derive the concept of God from experience either. So David Hume was observing certain things, but that only asks me a further question. You really haven't explained the phenomena of value pursuit, Mr. Hume, why people pursue values, how that he doesn't understand where emotions comes from either. So you have no connection to my emotions, my motivations, my goals. The real purpose and need for ethics in human life goes completely under the radar, undiscovered. And that is why people like Ayaan Ali Hirsi, for example, has recently found Christianity again. It is the values. And it's a bunch of bad values too. It's not just Dawkins, it's not just Ion Ollie Hersey, it's Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist, who said you should question with boldness even the existence of God. He was a scholar of Greek. He did his own translation of the New Testament, and he cut out all the miracles because he was a good Enlightenment scientific guy, but he left in the ethical teachings. And he elsewhere explicitly said that Jesus was the greatest moralist of all time. Now, when Thomas Jefferson is saying that, you know that the better minds are still screwed up about Christian ethics. And I reject Christian ethics as evil, as hostile to life on earth. Turn the other cheek, celibacy, poverty, humility, unconditional forgiveness, all the things I just went over are the opposite of my view of ethics. The opposite. I regard Jesus' ethics as immoral. But I can only come to that conclusion because I have a rational, sound foundation for my ethics. I want to live. I think human life is the standard of moral values. Well, you see, now that I'm oriented towards life, and in particular my life, I have now a way of generating an objective set of values that can govern my life. But absent that deeper philosophical framework, but it's deeper than ethics. One thing I want to point out is that, as I say, it goes into epistemology, and the errors in epistemology that modern philosophers kept spouting out are also the direct result of their religious thinking. Also the direct result of their religious thinking. All of these dichotomies, contingent versus necessary, that Leibniz made so famous. Well, Leibniz was saying also his solution to the problem of evil. Why would God allow evil if he's this omnipotent, benevolent being? Well, Leibniz said his answer was, this is the best any God could do. This is the best of all possible worlds. And so there's these contingent possibilities, there's a whole menu of worlds that God could have chosen from, you see, and he just happened to choose this one. There's all these other, they're just contingent, whether, the water boils at a certain degree. Could water boil 5 degrees differently? Yeah, it's just a contingent fact. And so this whole, Ayn Rand says, no, of course, necessity, being is necessity. There aren't all these other possible worlds. This world we have is it. And it's configured in such a way that it's got to be the way it is. And so the necessary contingent dichotomy, which led, by the way, to the analytic synthetic dichotomy. But let's go deeper than that. The theory practice dichotomy. What on earth could get someone to think that something could be good in theory if it doesn't work in practice? And you hear that about communism all the time. Oh, communism
my God,
is in the right place. There's good in theory. No, bullshit. It's a bad theory. It's a bad theory.
You left out a very important dichotomy, which I think might be the source of the rest of the dichotomies. Let's see. Come on, Jim. What's the primary one?
Well, I think there are 2 ways you can look at primary: perceptual versus conceptual. But theory, not just theory and practice, but mind, body.
That's what I'm looking for. Now we can give you a cigar.
Yes, indeed. Again, I won't smoke a cigar. I used to, but anyway.
Well, no one wants a cigar. What are we going to do with all these damn cigars?
Give them to someone who wants cigars.
Very altruistic of you, Jim.
Not at all. Very selfish. Anyway. Yes. Ayn Rand, this might be interesting in this context. All of those false dichotomies that Ayn Rand was keen to refute, all of them, mind, body, theory, practice, real, ideal, contingent, necessary, analytic, synthetic, you name it. And her magnum opus, the theme of her magnum opus was exactly to cut through what she thought was a big one: the role of the mind in human survival and existence. That's the theme of Atlas Shrugged: the importance of the mind, theory to practice. But it all begins, like you say, with mind, body, and things like that. Now, in her very earliest philosophical notes, written when she was still in her 20s, and she's starting out, these are the beginnings of an amateur philosopher. I mean, literally, they're her first notes on philosophy that we possess. And she appears to be saying out loud in those notes, this is my first shot at stating my philosophy out loud. These are the beginnings of an amateur philosopher, she says. Well, in her very first notes, she says, I want to know why it is that people can live one way and think an entirely different way. How this theory and how this practice are so separated. And she says, I know who the culprit is. It's religion. It gets them to be hypocrites before they even know better about ethics. It gets them to be frauds before they even have an idea of what an honest ethics would look like. And if you think about it, it's true. What we've done by merely positing a supernatural dimension, that's all it takes. Suggest that a supernatural dimension exists, and you've right there driven a wedge between the real and the ideal. This world here can never live up to this perfect ideal world, this better world. And you see it in all different manifestations. Plato's world of forms. Plato discovers the world of concepts, right? And so it can't be the men and the horses that he sees around him. Man and horse exist in a perfect ideal state in this world of forms. And the Christians very much adopt this Platonic dualism about the ideal and the materially real. They don't call them materially real. They, in fact, the greater reality is this kingdom of heaven, or this world of forms, as Plato would call it. It's the greater reality. This is the temporary, illusory corruption of all things. And so we better get our eyes focused away from this world onto the superior, better place where perfection can exist. Now, think about all the manifestations of that. How many times are we told perfection is impossible? Not just moral perfection. You could go into a geometry class and say, no one can draw a straight line. There is no line. You can't draw a line. There is no such thing as a point. A point is a mental abstraction. Well, of course, a point's a mental abstraction. A triangle is a mental abstraction. I cannot draw what you call a, quote, perfect triangle, but that's not the material world just cannot live up to this world of abstract ideal. And there we have ultimately, see, if you declare war on this world, if, like Jesus, you're focused on the kingdom of heaven as opposed to this world where we do have to toil and spin and work for our food, if your focus is on this world, right? You'll say, hey, it's a good thing to earn money and be wealthy and successful. It's a good thing to fall in love and have a rewarding sex life. You won't be like Christianity, right? You'll say this world has the goodies in it, not this other world. And so, but what does that do? It drives a wedge between mind and body. Once you've said it's getting into this world, this next dimension is all important, then suddenly it's your ability to sacrifice everything about this world and your contempt for this world. And how does that focus? Your body. Soon you declare war on reality and you declare war on your own body. So notice that mystics in the Far East and mystics in the West are unified about asceticism. You've got the Indian yogis who become shriveled, skinny guys because they never eat or drink anything and they sit in one spot just to be miserable forever and ever and ever. And you've got in the West vows of celibacy and poverty by the clerics. You've got people whipping their backs, literally bloody. Literally bloody. Asceticism.
Wait, you don't do that?
No, I don't. Well, some people do it for the kink purposes,
Whoa.
but I would say that itself is a psychological manifestation of this very thing. You declare war on the body when you posit a supernatural dimension at the end of the day. That is why all mystics ultimately end up, in the consistent ones, end up as ascetics, declaring war on their own bodies in the name of this superior dimension out there. All of these dichotomies that Ayn Rand was cutting through still exist. They still exist in the minds of atheists. They still exist in the minds of scientists. They still exist in the minds of people who might politically, you think, should know better. No, all of these modes of thinking, as well as just sort of assumed values that they've been transmitted emotionally and psychologically to them. They just assume those emotions and values are givens, and that's what the true ethics are. And sometimes they'll say it's, evolutionary biology has created altruism in us. Bullshit. That's not true at all. Evolutionary biology does not stop people from acting non-altruistically, does it? Or violating people's rights, does it? So no, it does. There is no. And we assume all the values that human beings have accumulated the knowledge of values that human beings have accumulated through the centuries. No, no, no. We can't do that, my friends. There is no ethical, innate ethics built into our psychology. We program our emotions. We program the values that will manifest in our emotions. So there's a relationship between emotions and values, absolutely. But you can't use emotions as the standard. And you see, that's another reason emotion. Here's another classic dichotomy. Mystics, if you don't go by reason, there's only one thing left: emotions. I prefer to believe this. And at the end of the day, their emotions take precedence over their reason. And sometimes they realize, well, no, sometimes I need to be reasonable, rational, logical. Other times, no, I want this corner over here where I can indulge my preferences, my belief preferences. And so just give me this area. So there's got to be a dichotomy between reason and emotion. There has to be. And as it develops through the course of history, some emotions, you see the ones connected to our bodily lusts and appetites, those are low material, dirty temptations. Yes, you see, just like Jesus pointed out. But there are these higher emotions. Contemplation of the truth, contemplation of religious beauty or whatever. There are these higher emotions and lower emotions. You even see it in the ancient Greeks before Christianity. Aristotle, even the best of the ancient Greeks, said pure contemplation for its own sake is the highest of all forms of reasoning, and it may not have any practical application whatever. Well, there I have to disagree with Aristotle. There's nothing that won't have potential practical applications, and we're doing it to learn about reality and to be effective in reality. So even he had this sort of theory practice split because because of not Christianity, but because of even more primordial religious ideas, different primordial religious ideas that were still having a lingering effect on him. But go all the way up to say like John Stuart Mill, who's trying to reconcile rights and utilitarianism. And he says, well, there are higher forms of happiness and lower forms of happiness, you see. But all of that is a manifestation of religion. Whether these people know it or not, it's this religious metaphysics that has informed the way they think, their values, and by the emotional transmission of values, they just assume the values that they have been taught. The goods are here, the ethics are here, and all we have to do is consult our conscience, consult the innate ideas that are in us, our evolutionary biology or whatever, and that will inform our ethics. No, ethics is like any other science. It has to be inferred from reality, based on observation, based on our experience, logically integrated into a consistent whole with a foundation explaining to me what the hell values are and why we need them, which is where Ayn Rand famously starts her ethics.
You mentioned how ethics is a practical science. It's about how to live in this world. And I recently read an article by a therapist. Her name is Antonieta Contreras. I interviewed her the other day, and she's not an objectivist by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the reasons she said relationships fail is because people go into these relationships with really faulty ideas. One, that like the other person is supposed to complete them in some way. And another reason she said is that people tend to think they have to sacrifice for their partner, and they end up giving up parts of their self, which just in the end breeds resentment. And I thought it was absolutely amazing that a non-objectivist would see this that clearly. So I had an interview. It was a really great discussion. But the point I'm trying to make is that these ideas of ethics have real world application. This is not just pie in the sky philosophers debating about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. This is how we actually live our lives, how we actually gain our happiness, how we conduct ourselves in our dealings with ourselves, with other people. It's very, very vital that we get this stuff right.
Life and death vital. Life and death vital. As I say, if you come about it like Kant does, where consequences really don't matter and you have to do your duty no matter what, you're just waiting for oceans of blood to be spilled, aren't you? That's a
Right.
Holocaust waiting to happen, in effect. And as Leonard Peikoff demonstrates in his book, The Ominous Parallels to My Satisfaction, in any case, you're absolutely right. Getting these things straight is of vital importance. Do you want to be a self-flagellating medieval monk who takes a vow of celibacy and is poor and sleeps on rocks? Or do you want to have a decent, comfortable life and achieve something here on earth? And you notice the other thing too, religious ethics doesn't get people to think in terms of achievement here on earth at all. It gets them to think about the no-nos. I can't do that. I can't do that. I can't do that. Let's get the rules straight here. The no-nos. Okay, so long as I don't have the no-nos, then I can indulge my immoral or at least amoral, selfish self for the rest of the time. But the truth is that, just that approach is itself the product of a religious way of looking at things. How about the heroes? What makes a hero? Why is a creatively rational scientist, doctor, artist, architect a heroic being? Why is a person who follows principle and commits their life to a principle, even a person who's willing to risk their life for that principle, you and I would say that's a selfish thing because he's committed to that principle in a
Sure.
conceptual way. But great heroes in history have paid an enormous price for their heroism. They've tried to eliminate slavery, like Lincoln, and ended up getting assassinated. It seems to me that there are some people in this world who, because of their devotion to true ideals, are moral ideals, are heroes at the end of the day. They fought slavery, let's say. So, what is the achieve? Why don't we say the achievers are heroes? Why is it that we reserve it to, okay, well, these are the no-nos, these are the. It's not a set of negatives. It's not a set of negatives out of context either. Ethics is a whole approach to life. It's a whole approach to life. So being productive, being rational, those are key virtues. Those are important because they will produce the positive values that my life requires. The ultimate value, my life requires.
Jim, I think it's a perfect place for us to stop. But, well, maybe it's not because I'm going to say something else. So I guess that will be the perfect place to stop. But one of my favorite essays by Ayn Rand is, I don't know if it's lesser known, but it certainly seems to be lesser known. And that's Causality versus Duty. It is really cuts through this whole idea that we have a duty to do certain actions independent of their consequences. It's fantastic. It's available online if you just Google, for those of you who haven't read it, Ayn Rand, Causality versus Duty. It'll come up. I highly recommend it.
Why we need principles in ethics and why principles in ethics aren't simply duties in Kant's sense, duties to virtue itself or the noumenal world, or duties in Jesus' sense to the kingdom of heaven and God. No, it's not a question of duty, ladies and gentlemen, but we do have to think long term. We do have to think in terms of principles. And so if I think long term and in terms of principles, it'll sometimes seem like I'm foregoing a short term, I'm giving up a short term pleasure for a long term value. But wait a minute, that's really even more selfish. That's not a question of duty at all, is it? That's a
Yeah.
question of being selfish in the long run,
No,
being
but
selfish in a principled way.
if there is a duty, I will say this: the duty is to both like and share this episode wherever you can. That is it. That is a duty. That's a
That's a
command.
categorical imperative.
Yes, that's the 11th commandment. Jim, where can folks find you?
Well, I'm on Facebook almost every day. You can come find me on the Ayn Rand site, the John Galt site, the Leonard Peikoff Study and Appreciation site. If you have questions about objectivism, I'm a regular on the Ayn Rand Center UK's podcasts. I help do for members at Ayn Rand Center UK, subscribers only. I lead seminars in Leonard Peikoff's courses, and I'll be doing a course on constitutional law coming up here not too far. I've also got my book, Creating Christ, which you mentioned at the beginning. And you can find that at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any bookstore. And there's a website, www.creatingchrist.com.
Excellent, Jim. Thanks again, and we'll have you back soon, of course, as you're our regular guy, and we
I'm honored and
appreciate you.
flattered. Thank you.
All right, for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.